Well, welcome everyone. Anyone who's new here and doesn't know it, our guest this evening is Duncan Minshull. He's been described as Britain's walking laureate, and he has a new anthology of walking published by Notting Hill Editions, in which he's brought together a band of globetrotting writers who've walked the world. Now, if there's anyone here who's new to a salon, isn't familiar with them, let me tell you first a little bit about Walk, Listen, Create. We're a social enterprise. We try to support artists, performers, and writers who either make work on foot or to be experienced on foot or just write about walking, of which there probably is no one else who's actually written or read more about walking than Duncan. So what we've also do is we run a writing competition. I'm really pleased to see that Damaris is here. So we have two new writers in residence. One is Damaris West and the other is Chantal Lyon. They won our recent Walking Together writing competition, which is something we run every year, poetry and fiction. And we try to put these salons on to find out as much about how our guests approach writing and about walking, as much as they do about the content they write about. So it's we hope useful for budding writers. So the format is that Duncan and I will chat for about 20 minutes, then we open it up to you, and we close with a multiple choice quiz. And on my virtual screen, you can see a picture of the book. With some publishers, we are able to wrench from them a couple of ebooks to send to people. But this time, Notting Hill Editions have very kindly given us a print copy of the book. So one lucky winner will walk away with a print copy of the book. So over to Duncan, let me introduce him. Duncan, he's formerly a BBC radio producer for many years. He now writes and publishes books about the joys of travelling on 2 feet. And the titles include While Wandering for Vintage, Beneath My Feet and Sauntering for Notting Hill Editions, Where My Feet Fall for William Collins. And he's also written about walking in the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, UK Vogue, something called Psychologies, which I'm not sure what that is, Slightly Foxed, and The Big Issue. So Duncan, how should we start? We've had you on before. You've talked about an anthology of contemporary writers. Perhaps you should tell us how you came to choose the authors you've included in this in Globetrotting.
Yes. Good evening, and thank you everyone for, or to use an old-fashioned word, tuning in. This book, Globetrotting, is the third one for Notting Hill Editions, who are a lovely little, I suppose you could say, a boutique publishers, in that they aim to make beautiful books in the traditional way. Beautiful paper, beautiful typeset, linen bound, linen covered copies. No matter what the contents are, they're just lovely books to possess. And yeah, so this is my and they're produced in Turkey, I think, made in Turkey. So this is my third for them, and the three have followed a sort of a line. The first one was mainly a roundup of writing from the Middle Ages to the present time in the UK mainly. That was called Beneath My Feet. The second one was called Sauntering, which was a history of walking across Europe. Again, it was about the same number of writers, about 50 contributors in it. And then this one, the third one, I thought, well, I've done Europe, I better do the world. So it's writers not necessarily have walked right around the world, but if you put the book together, the world has been covered. The 7 continents have been walked in some shape or form. From, well, you got Christopher Columbus in 1492, setting foot in the Bahamas and meeting the locals. And it goes right up to people like William Boyd walking a beach in Acapulco, somewhere like that. So,
Rio de Janeiro, I believe, was it
no,
not?
Rio, sorry, Rio. Yeah, just outside Rio, not Acapulco, no. And yeah, so hopefully arrange and sort of not that one does positive discrimination, but I'm happy that all the books seem to be more or less 50-50 male, female, which is good. So yes, this last one is sort of traversing the 7 continents.
And with this one in particular, you know, there are few of them are essay length pieces. I think your last anthology were essay length pieces, and for this one, it's excerpts from diaries and journals, which I imagine for you actually meant that you had to do a lot more reading and a lot more research, and probably a lot more editing. Was that the case?
I think it was. I mean, the last book we talked about here was Where My Feet Fall for William Collins, and that was a book of specially commissioned essays. I asked 20 writers to write specially commissioned pieces between 2,500 and 4,000 words. So you knew what you were going to get. But here, yeah, the material is, I mean, the books are only about 35,000 words long. So in terms of anthologies, they're sort of neat little, rather concise little publications. And I thought, get in as many writers as possible. I mean, you could fill it with just 10 writers, very long pieces, but I thought get as much variety and breadth as possible. So yeah, each of these 3 has got about 50 writers in it, which meant you could do long pieces. There are some pieces that are sort of 1,500 words long, and then other pieces are barely half a page long. But I quite like that variety, you know, running a long piece and then a little short piece and then another long piece, or then 2 little short pieces. Because I think at the end of the day, it's how you position all these pieces is the most important thing about anthologizing.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, is this a book for dipping in, or is it a book from start to finish? It could be either, couldn't it?
I think you could also 30,000 words. You could sit down and read the whole thing in a few hours, or you could just dip into it. And of course, they're very nice, 6 inches by 4 inches. I do say rather glibly, you could take it on a walk with you. You know, it slips in a pocket very, very nicely. So if you need inspiration halfway through a particular walk, you can just get the book out. Yeah. And read about Christopher Columbus in the Bahamas.
So, okay, so much of the, well, Christopher Columbus even predates the 19th century, but much of the writing dates from the 19th century, which possibly was an expansion of travel by the wealthy to their colonies and beyond. So,
Yeah.
So how much of the writing did you have to modernize in style or content, or did you not modernize anything?
I didn't really modernize anything. And if there was some awkwardnesses over expression, i.e. words that you're not supposed to use these days, I don't remember taking them out. But having said that, I don't think there's any offense in the material I used either. There might be condescension, but there isn't offense necessarily. But you're right about the 19th century. It was a sort of a walking age, and it did throw up a whole sort of range of types of walkers, you know, from explorers to scientists to sort of literary flâneurs to tourists to runaways, the whole gamut. And yes, to a certain extent, it is the white Anglo-Saxon male and female going to sort of far-flung regions. But there's quite a few local indigenous types in the selection as well. You know, in Australia, Pakistan, India. Yeah, I've got local writers in there as well. And yes, it was quite a lot of work. But you see, I always try and negotiate with the publishers a long a long time to deliver. So it means it's only ever a labor of love. It's not like I've got to quickly do it all in about 3 months, because I've got other things to do and everything, and you want it to be a labor of love. I usually spend about a year, even 15 months from beginning to end, which means you can spend about 6 months getting as much material together as possible, and then another 6 months sorting it out, editing it, as you say, the red pen comes out, ordering it, putting it in the order, which is the most difficult but most enjoyable thing to do. And then you write your introduction, you know, about 3,000 words. So yeah, about sort of 12 to 15 months. And then the good thing about that, Andrew, is you can then just do 3 hours a day, or three hours per day, say 5 days a week. It's a nice thing to do between the hours of 2 and 5, I find.
The other thing I was going to say is that you're going to have to clear all those permissions too, because I bet you the publisher does absolutely nothing.
Well, Notting Hill edition with the last books, they've been very good.
Oh,
And,
great.
there aren't, for budgetary reasons rather than sort of creative reasons, there weren't too many to clear. There weren't too many in copyright. But I have done big anthologies before where you've been literally chasing around the world, not walking around the world, but chasing around the world, trying to find out who owns the rights and all that sort of thing. It's a terrible business. And, you know, the more conglomerate corporate publishing gets, the fewer number of people they have dealing with permissions, as they're called. So you're always forming a queue somewhere, and it's usually one beleaguered person trying to, you know, negotiate all the rights with you. It must be a thankless job to do at the publishers. It's also pretty thankless applying for permissions all the time, you know, with your fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Then on top of that, before you even get to discuss the money part of it, they ask outrageous amounts of money for, say, 400 words, something like that. So again, you know, you've then got another choice. Do you use that piece that's going to cost you a lot of money, or do you find a replacement? So, you know,
I was really surprised with Globetrotting itself when I asked about the photograph. It's a chap standing on a glacier, isn't it? I don't know where it comes from.
It's a great photo. I've always loved that photo, and I was lucky enough to be able to use it. It's by Laura Gilpin, and that's actually Colorado. I thought it'd be somewhere like the Sahara or the Gobi or something like that, but it's actually Colorado. I think it's called that expanse of land. It's called the Colorado Sands, and I think it was shot in the 50s. And she's quite famous, actually. She's no longer around, but I don't think we paid an extortionate amount.
Oh, no, I do know how much Notting Hill paid. They paid £400, they said, but only for book jacket use.
Right. Oh, that's interesting.
So I couldn't reproduce it on the website as the image for the event, for example.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Oh,
So I could do it by putting the jacket inside the event, but I couldn't use it for the feature image.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was quite kind of wow, you know.
Yeah, that's what you get for £400.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I think I like the image because, yes, it's sort of it seems to pair walking down to its most existential state. It's just a man on his own. I think it is a man on his own, and all he leaves behind in the world are his footprints. And I think that's great. The other jacket I like was from a book I did for Vintage a long time ago, 20 years ago, where it was one of those, you probably know those famous walking figures by Giacometti, the bronze walkers, and they're not one gender or another. You know, you can't tell if it's man or woman, but they're brilliant. And again, it's just walking paired down to its essence is what one was trying to suggest.
Okay, so of the writers that you've chosen for this anthology,
yeah,
which of those would you have liked to accompany it on their travels? And why?
That's a very nice question. I think I'm going to rule out people like, I've got the list here, Roald Amundsen. I don't think I'd want to walk the Antarctic, really. And I'm not a great one for walking up mountains. So I think I'll rule out all the mountaineers. Beaches are wonderful. Walking along coastal stretches for mile after mile, I can always do that. And city walking, I love. It's the best way to get to know a city. So I'd like to go, and because I love her as a writer, I'd like to walk with Edith Wharton, who's always got a pithy thing to say. And Mark Twain is fun. He pokes fun at a dandy-ish figure in Geneva. So that would be fun as well, I think. And Michelle Roberts went to Kiev in 2010, while it was still a vibrant place. I guess that's 4 years before the Russians started misbehaving there. And it's a great city to walk around. It's one of the great boulevarding cities. So that would have been a good one as well. Colin Thubron just shuffled along in a queue to see Lenin's tomb. That would have been pretty memorable as well. And because I like the place, Isabella Bird walking through rural Japan would have been great as well.
So, well, you mentioned a few there as well. I mean, are there kind of cultural favorites or historic favorites? I mean, and also what's the current trend for aspiring writers to follow? Do you think it's to write travel or to write nature or to write experience, or what's the...
Yes, I think today's walking essay is travel, obviously, because how do you negotiate a new city you've arrived in? You walk around it, you put your bags in the hotel bedroom, and then you just set off. It's the best way to become acquainted with your setting. So yeah, definitely travel. And then there's the whole business of walking on your own or walking with other people. That's another thing. But also traveler's memoir. This whole walking gives you that space and time to sort of recollect or reminisce with yourself. It gives you that opportunity to talk with yourself about your past. So it's almost like walking as memory, walking as confession. So that's another thing. And then, I mean, you go in the bookshops and the walking through environments and paying respect to certain environments, heeding the ecological. That's a huge sort of genre in book publishing as well. So there are many facets to taking a walk, really.
There's a lot on pilgrimage too. We had Ollie Smith as a guest earlier on in the year, and he'd written on this holy island. But he also wrote about pilgrimages to sort of football grounds. But I think the other thing that I think that there's not much on is on processions. I think that's something that's to me that's something that hasn't kind of been written about.
Yeah, the history of the procession or the parade. Yeah. And if you think about it, you would join up a parade or a procession for all manner of reasons. It could be religious, it could be historical, it could be just celebratory, the end of a war, that sort of thing. There's so many different reasons, or it could be protest as well, which is huge. And I've got a few processions in here as well. There's there are a couple, and that's an interesting, because it's not so much like Laura Gilpin's figure on the front of Globetrotting. It's exactly the opposite. It's communality. It's sociability. It's being with other people. You hear you hear this all the time. Oh, I met my husband or I met my wife on a protest march. I love that. It is about walking with others, and if the walk is a protest, somehow your convictions are reinforced when you're walking with other people. If you're on a protest march of one through the Colorado sands, I'm not sure how committed you'd feel about it after an hour or something like that. On the cover of the book, that sort of walk is almost that walker's memoir. you know, the walk as memory. What am I doing here? I'm thinking, you know, I've got problems to sort out, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you've got one. Is it Mary Gaunt who writes about the lonely bloke or the lonely?
Yeah, that's I often read that one when I do events, because I always want to include as many strange walks
I mean, do you want to read that one or read another
I
one?
haven't got it with me,
Oh, of course you haven't got it with
alas.
you.
I haven't
What's
got the book with me, but I'll try and explain it. Mary Gaunt was a sort of Edwardian travel writer, and she ends up in the middle of nowhere in I think it's West Africa, and she goes to stay over Easter time with a very rather sad figure, a man who's been posted out there for some reason, and he lives in a sort of hacienda type place in a clearing in the forest, and sort of every night she's aware of him sort of walking up and down his veranda. You know, it's the shortest walk in the book, probably. Just clump, 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 clump. And when she asks him about this, he confesses, it's the lonely man's walk. It's what I do to get to sleep at night. Excuse me. And he confesses to having had a few drinks. And when he can't see the decking properly, when the planks aren't quite as straight as they're supposed to be, or they blur into each other, he knows he's had far too much to drink, and then he walks off to his bed. Quite sad, quirky but sad.
Okay, well, look, I think this is the opportunity for other people to ask questions if they so wish. But as there are so few of us, I mean, you know, I don't think we need to wait for people to write in the chat. If there's anyone who wants to just unmute yourself and jump in and ask a question.
Figures walking across the square. This is a Giacometti. Well, you mentioned Giacometti sculptures and about walking. Particular one of his that I like is the figures walking across the square. There's a genuine tension, and no one seems to collide. My question is there anything walking across the square? For example, it could be a dance if people are doing it in an existential way, as opposed to if you're crossing the square to get somewhere. Is there anything you could say about the different states of mind of people walking across squares?
Wow. Well, I think possibly for a lot of people, the most famous image of walking across a square is, if you look, I don't know what the square is called, but if you look at photographs or film footage of modern day Tokyo, there was that famous square where they're going across the zebra crossings, and it's thousands and thousands of people. Most of them look like commuters on foot, and at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And what do they call them in Japan? Salarymen and salarywomen. It looks like they're off to the office. And so the sort of walking across squares always has a slightly discomforting effect for me, because I always remember that Tokyo image. But of course, there are lots of reasons to walk across squares. I mean, probably the most charming is in Italy, Spain, France mainly. You get that ritual at 5 o'clock in the afternoon called the Passio or the Passeggiata, when people in their local town all meet together and they walk up and down the square. You know, it's everyone from 8 to 80 years old, and it's a sort of evening ritual all through the year, and people do it to meet their neighbors, or to meet up with their boyfriends, girlfriends, or to bring the family out on a daily jaunt. So that is in exact opposite to the Tokyo scenes, really. Yeah, those passios and passeggiatas are charming, I think. So those are the two walking across squares examples I can think of, really.
Can I just follow it up? But there's something sort of anarchic about walking across the square. It's like a different space to walking down the road, and like it's infinity, and you lose everything. You lose a sense of direction, and it becomes a thing in itself. That's all.
Yes, I once wrote a piece for one of the papers about trying to do the passeggiata in England, And so I thought I'd experiment in Trafalgar Square and see if it was anything like the experience in, say, Rome or Milan, and it wasn't. It was horrible. And of course, the Paseo and the Passeggiata, what they have in their favor in those sort of Mediterranean towns, they have the weather, and we don't have the weather. And you need good weather to sort of hang around and loiter and walk slowly and take the whole thing in. And I remember, I think it was all virtually raining the day I did it in Trafalgar Square. So it was nothing like the experience in, say, Rome. No.
Anyway, Lydia, you're waving a hand. Have a go.
A real hand, not a virtual one. Yeah, Bob's question reminded me of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, who walked in a square in the plaza, in a circle as protest for years and years. Protest their disappeared children. So that combines two forms of walking, the protest and the walking in a square.
I went there once and I experienced that firsthand, and it was incredible. There were about 200 or 300 of them.
Yeah.
And they go round in a clockwork or anti-clockwise. It's very regimented. I guess because they've been doing it so long, they know the most effective way of doing it, which is to sort of formation.
In formation and silent.
In silent. And yes, and it does have, I wouldn't say it has religious overtones, but it has acutely emotional overtones. And then I remember also in the same visit when I was there, it was the year of, they had that terrible financial crash in Argentina. I can't remember. It was at least 15 years ago. So there was another sort of protest march, which was totally unruly. It was people just taking up residency in the streets, and they were walking up and down past the banks and knocking on the bank doors with sort of wooden spoons and kitchen implements. And it was peaceful, but it was angry because they'd lost all their money in these banks that were all boarded up. So it was from the somber to the even more somber, really. But maybe there's something in the Latin American blood that when they're angry or provoked, they protest on foot. Mind you, we do here as well, don't we? I mean,
Yeah, Quentin's put something in the chat. He said, is it maybe the UK equivalent of seaside promenading?
We do a bit of that, yeah. The Paseo and the Passeggiata, yeah, we just do it along the prom when the weather's good. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I think there's a version of the Passeggiata in Leeds on a Saturday night, which is sort of Hogarthian rather than Mediterranean.
Yeah, not so well behaved, is it? And I think for Leeds, you could also probably say a lot of our cities, Friday and Saturday nights, yes, at your peril.
Do you have anything on the Camino de Santiago?
Not in this book. In the book of commissioned essays, one of the it was a point of comedy for her. It was a writer called Ingrid Perso, and she did the whole thing in different stages, increments. But she said to us, the reader, I'm the most unsuitable walker in the world. I can barely cross the road. Yet she did this amazing journey. And I think you'll find, I don't know if you've walked it or parts of it yourself, but I think you find your seasoned hikers and ramblers and whatnot, but you find a lot of people who it's almost their first long, serious walk, and obviously they're doing it for reasons spiritual, definitely emotional. But yes, you do find a lot of rookies on that walk. I did it for 5 minutes once. I was in a town called Vitoria in northern Spain, and I didn't know this, but I was walking through the town, and it showed signposts. It said, if you were on this track here, you're on the Camino. So I was on it for about 5 or 10 minutes just to get from one side of the square to the other. So at least I can say I've been on it, but I don't really own up to the fact that I was only on it for about 300 yards.
Now, Quentin's put in a really good question in the chat. I'm assuming, Quentin, you've got no audio, but no, he has no audio. So he's written, did you include any writing in the book which you fundamentally disagree with?
Oh, that's a good one, isn't it? In fact, you should really, as an anthologist. Let me have a look at the contents. It's not so much I disagreed with the walk they did, but sometimes, you know, people's tone. You disagree with the tone or their attitude, particularly going back to that 19th century walker, which is often that sort of rather knickerbockered, mustachioed or bearded man of empire who sort of walks through the land disclaiming, thinking nothing's quite as good as doing this at home. And everywhere you go in the world is inferior in some way. And I think a lot of that 19th century travel, to a certain extent, was to confirm people's almost prejudices that everything back home was much better. There's a bit of that sort of condescending tone, slightly, but it doesn't prevail. It's not the overriding tone in the book, I have to say.
What I was going to ask, actually, Duncan, because I mean, you've got years and years of experience of making radio programs, many of which include writers reading their work, writers writing for radio. Were the pieces in this anthology you thought, wow, they would have been, they'd be great to be included in a radio program, and
Yeah.
you know, what's the difference between a piece you read and a piece that you listen to?
Well, I always used to think that a piece of writing is good on the page or on the ear, but not every piece of writing in the world covers both. But I would say, going back to selecting writing for radio, I think first and foremost, you've got to have a strong narrative thread going through the piece to keep people engaged. I wouldn't say plot all the time, but a narrative thread, you know, something that, a thought or a situation that goes strongly from A to B and doesn't get too complicated. Ditto the style. The writing style has to be pretty plain and simple so that your actor or your author can read it out loud quite easily and the audience can listen to it quite easily. You don't want complicated stuff. I mean, it's bad enough reading complicated stuff that you have to keep flipping back the pages to before it properly sinks in. And of course, with the heard experience of a piece of writing, you can't keep flipping back. You know, you only get one grab at it, really. So therefore, it's got to be pretty clear cut. I would say that that's the main criteria. And yes, these books I did for Notting Hill Editions, they've never had an audio version. And I think that'd be great because most of the pieces are first person. And, you know, to quote Charles Dickens, something always happens on a walk. He's dead right. You know, there is usually some sort of revelation or, you know, memorable experience, something to write down and record. The last book I did, the one where the essays that were specially commissioned, Where My Feet Fall, there was an audio version of that. And I think it worked quite well, actually. Because every walk is a journey across the page. You know, the walk is going from A to B. That's what you want your narrative to be as well on the page. So the two are hand in hand.
Bob's banging on about squares again. Bob, do you want to say something about squares? Has he disappeared? He may have disappeared. He said to me, he sent me a note to say he was going to see The Apprentice tonight. And the works of Roy Cohn and
oh yeah, it looks good, that film.
I'm going to go tomorrow night. I'm going to go tomorrow night to see it. Okay.
Yeah.
I can't read. I put a question, but I can't read it with my even with my glasses on. So I'll say, back to squares. They've always been the end site of demonstrations, most notably the Aldermaston marches in the late 50s and the early 60s, that gave them specifically Trafalgar Square, which was just a place where pigeons used to drop things and whatever. But Aldermaston gave it a notoriety and gave it a political dimension. And from that point onwards, I would think that might have created a precedent in making squares, certainly in England, as political meeting points for political demonstrations. I don't know. It's just a thought that I had.
Yeah. There is, well, I think there is a tradition of walking our squares, walking our streets, particularly in London, in demonstration. You know, the Cable Street marches. It goes right back to you know, this is out of London, sort of, you know, the walks about the protests over enclosed or open plan farming. You know, people would walk the fields there in protest. And the Chartists, you know, political reform walks. You know, yeah, there's a huge history of the protest march or the protest walk. Yes,
this was a 4-day walk from Aldermaston, and it climaxed Trafalgar Square. It was like a really symbolic thing. And I remember walking through the streets of London and shouting at all the buildings, and there were no police and no people present. It was quite a precedent, I think, in certainly in English society.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Yes, indeed.
Okay, has anyone got any other questions at this stage? I mean, we might go into the quiz and give you that fiendish quiz. I've got a couple more questions I could throw in. Well, I mean, first off, I think you know, what's the next writing quest, Duncan? What are you doing next? Are you doing an anthology, another anthology?
Yeah, I'm doing another anthology for Notting Hill Editions. It's called, it's another walking one. It's called The Indigo Hours, indigo as in the color, and it's about night walking. So, and the structure there is very easy. You know, it's people writing about setting off at dusk, and then you take it right through to midnight, the early hours, and then it ends with a few people walking towards dawn. So that's got a nice built-in structure that book has. And I think I've just finished it, or I've finished the first draft. And it was great. And it throws up the big thing about women walking at night, of course. You know, you'd think through the ages that women chose not to walk at night, but many did. Many chose not to walk at night, of course, for obvious reasons, but also many did. I mean, it's fascinating. So that's another book that's sort of 50-50 almost in terms of male and female contributors, yet it's all about the rather dangerous or murky experience of walking in the dark hours. Yeah, so that's out, I think, in about a year's time, something like that.
And is that going to be historical and contemporary writers?
Yeah, that's very much how all these Notting Hill ones are. Goes from, you know, 1500s up to the present day. And again, I hope it's a nice mix of known writers and unknown writers.
Yeah, no, that's good. Now, I mean, you know, I've got a couple of poets on this in the room. I've got Lydia and Damaris, and there might be someone else hiding there who's a poet. So, you know, writing about walking in poetry, would either Damaris or Lydia like to suggest writers that, because of course the anthology, you don't include any poetry, do you?
No poetry, but there might be some poets. No, I just keep it to the non-fiction sort of formats, you know, memoir, travel, journals, letters, that sort of thing. I think because the book's only 35,000 words, I think if you started putting bobs of verse in it, it might make it a bit too bitty. Although having said that, I know, you know, there is a huge tradition of poets who write. It almost needs its own book, you know, walking poetry. Yeah, maybe I should.
Would you be up for that, or
Maybe I should. Yeah, yeah. But now I've suggested it, somebody else can do it, I suppose.
Yeah, Lydia and Damaris, you're doing it. Yeah,
Yeah.
No.
So my first book is called A History of Walking, and each poem is a different type of walking that's just used as a vehicle to explore us
Yes.
as animals who walk on their hind legs and are kind of blessed and cursed with this need to connect and you know, make a hash of it most of the time. I was thinking of Dorothy Wordsworth, perhaps, as you know, not a poet, but somebody who did an awful lot of walking, and you know, quite overshadowed by her brother. But you know, they would think nothing of walking an extra 15 miles on a 40-mile walk to look at a waterfall. And that's kind of walking I really admire.
They've, I suppose, because of who they are and the sort of lives they led and everything, they had the leisure time to go and look for that waterfall or whatever, you know. They didn't have to get back to the office or anything like that.
Kitchen.
Yeah, I've got a chunk of Dorothy Wordsworth in the Night Walking book. And it's exactly that about her and William setting off on a night walk. And because when you walk at night, all the senses are exaggerated or distorted. What you see, what you smell, what you hear, everything's accentuated or sort of blown out of proportion. And of course, they hear bird song and they can't work out what sort of bird it is and that sort of thing. So yeah, and being poets, they're very sensitive to the setting they're in. And fortunately, I was glad to have her in it rather than her brother actually doing the writing. Yes, it's a good piece as far as I can remember. I think it was the Lake District.
Look forward to reading it.
Yeah, yes. But yes, you're right. They walked a lot together, didn't they?
I was just thinking of Robert Frost, walking with Edward Thomas.
Yes. I've got some Edward Thomas in the Night book as well. Again, another poet who's completely in tune with his setting, attuned to his setting. Yeah, wonderful, great stuff.
It's a wonderful poem by Anthony Dunn about Edward Thomas and Robert Frost walking together. It's in a book called Take This One to Bed.
Yeah, and it's a tradition that goes on, you know. If you think of sort of the laureate Simon Armitage, he wrote a very nice book about walking, I think, in the north of England. He's still laureate, isn't he? Yeah, so there is a tradition.
Yeah, it wasn't so much a poem though. That was you know,
no, it wasn't a poem.
That was a travel book, a memoir.
It was a travel book.
Yeah. And it was called Walking Home, and he troubadoured his way along the Pennine Way. I mean, that's
it. Yeah.
So he
self-styled troubadour. Yeah.
Yeah, he got his supper by doing performance poetry.
Yes.
As he went along, and I think the second one he did was Walking Away, and he walked the southwest coast path, but he didn't actually complete it, and I had to admit that he did have to hurry back to get back to the office, whatever the office was.
Yeah. But of course, walking for poets, more than for prose writers, it is a tool. It's a way of, if you've got a poem on the go in your head, then often the way you walk creates a rhythm. It creates the meter for your thoughts, which is why no doubt you saw lots of poets scurrying around the countryside, actually scurrying to get back to their desks, to lay down their thoughts in the rhythm they created on their walks. Yeah, so yeah, meter, poetic meter, and the way you walk, they're both strongly linked.
Mhm. Yes, you're always advised to take a notebook and pencil.
Yes, those
Yeah.
age-old things. Yes,
I'm
very
trying to
good.
remember the name of the writer. It might have been Hobbes, who had a walking stick with an inkwell in the top.
Oh, that's brilliant.
I mean, he could have used a pencil.
Yes.
I think he was making a point, and he
Yeah.
could stop and dip his pen in and take notes
Yeah.
on a walk.
But I think also, you know, it's very particular to poets, but also a lot of writers, they wouldn't consider themselves, you know, dyed-in-the-wool walkers, but most of them do find walking useful because it's something about, yeah, the rhythm of a walk sort of shakes the brain down. It gets you thinking. Also, physically, you know, walking releases endorphins into your system, so you become upbeat, and often that can encourage thought, which leads to creative thought. And, you know, everything's jigged up much more than just sitting at your desk looking at a blank screen, you know. I even used to do that at the BBC. If I was stuck on something, I'd just go for a walk around the block. And it made you feel better anyway. But B, it often, you know, unlocked things to a certain extent.
So Duncan, you get the last word.
Why?
Yeah, you do. And while you're saying the last words, I'm just going to put in the chat how they can get hold of your book and what the salons are.
Thank you. Oh, you want me to read an extract from the book?
If you want, or you can just have the last word.
Well, shall I read? I could read the last section very quickly in the book. It's called Globetrotting Gobbets. And what I do is I just take basically a couple of lines from they're lines I couldn't really fit in the book properly in a longer form for either space reasons or for copyright reasons. So I just do a little roundup of one-liners at the end of the book as a final treat. And this time I called it Globetrotting Gobbets. And they go like this. Was I the German staying in Cacares and walking around the world for a prize? They insisted that I must be German, that I must be walking for a prize. For what other reasons could a man walk? That's V.S. Pritchett. The weather in Luanda is undecided, and so am I, Mary Kingsley. He used to go sleepwalking in Chumbi Valley. His mode of progression was that of bending forward, and it kept him going without any trouble. But he had one bad habit. He was a confirmed opium smoker. That's Francis Younghusband. Then I'll repeat what Andrew said. I could get more exercise. There's a path through the woods that I could take this rainy morning, but instead I will take a path to the pantry and mix a martini, John Cheever. Walking across the plateau at Latacunga was where those giant volcanoes occupied my attention and where I was rewarded with a magnificent eruption, and I was abundantly satisfied. Ida Laura Pfeiffer. A beard in Antarctica seems to me as awkward and as unpractical as, well, let's say, walking with a tall hat on each foot. That's Roald Amundsen. One of Tasmania's beaches, a spit of white sand stretching east to west, is named Bagot Point, and it is a rare beach where you can walk into sunrise and at the end of the day into sunset. And that was Nicholas Shakespeare.
Brilliant.
So that's the 7 continents in one-liners.
Brilliant. Well, Duncan, thank you very much again. Really enjoyable conversation. Thanks to everyone who came along.